Hello, hello. I'm Robin Hanson, and this is.
Dan Sarewitz here at Arizona State University Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes.
And I'm a professor of economics at George Mason University and also affiliated with the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. We're going to talk about some range of future-related issues, not entirely determined, but we both have overlapping interests here, so let's find out where we go.
Well, why don't we start by looking at a recent trope that is the dialogue around the term transhumanism that is structuring a debate about the commitment that humans ought to have to enhancing their cognitive and physical capabilities through technology.
Yes, so the phrase transhumanism has sort of engaged people. You've been able to entice people to argue over whether people should change a lot or a little, I guess, at some level.
It raises several big questions. One is the extent to which there's anything new here. Certainly, humans have been using technology to transform their capabilities, both cognitive and physical, probably since they became humans. Arguably, things are accelerating. Things are moving more to the inside of our bodies as well as just externally. But I think another set of issues has to do with whether the discussion itself is even coherent, because it demands categories like the natural and the human, or the normal and the enhanced. And I think it's questionable whether those sorts of categories have much currency anymore.
So I would think a lot of transhumans would think that they completely agree with you. That is, they think that other people are arbitrarily setting these boundaries over the limits of what we can change, and they agree that we have in fact changed an enormous amount over the last 100,000 years. And so they would say, yes, continuing the same rate of trends we've had in the past in the future means we'd have a lot of change, and that's a big deal. And other people maybe aren't really fully accepting how much change has happened, and therefore how much would be likely to continue to happen.
Yeah, although there is at the same time an implicit claim, and in many cases explicit, that the entire transhuman project is one of human improvement, including moral improvement, social improvement as a result of these improved, enhanced capabilities. And it's interesting there that they actually do focus on an age-old category, which is the individual, because transhumanism is very much about the choices that individuals can make to enhance their own capabilities. And I think that raises lots of interesting problems and questions.
Yeah, so I agree with that criticism. That is, transhumanists often pose it as, holding everything else constant. Wouldn't an individual like to have more capacity? Gee, why not? And then sort of imagining that what could go wrong if we each had more capacity.
Yeah, so there's two issues there, of course. One is it's not that individuals have complete freedom in making those decisions. I'd love to not use email. I loathe email, but of course I'm completely committed to using email because I can't survive without it.
Sure.
And then the other, of course, is the fact that individual decisions around these kinds of technologies don't accumulate additively. They lead to all sorts of emergent phenomena that may either make us happy or unhappy. And I think neither of those are integrated into the standard transhumanist discussions, which seem to assume that capabilities that are enhanced in the individual add up across society to a more enhanced society, and that seems a bit odd to me.
Right, so that's not really a very valid sort of assumption, but giving them credit, we can see how they've managed to take the future, which most people actually have very little interest in, and make it more engaging by connecting it with current issues over diversity. So they try to make, there's racism, and there's sexism, and there's, sexual preference, prejudice, and then there's just another prejudice against people modifying themselves, and they can throw themselves in with being a crusader for those people as well. So
Yeah, I guess, but there's also kind of an implicit, almost utopian assumption there that these enhancements will somehow act uniformly across society in ways that will kind of allow us to get past some of the fundamental dilemmas of the human condition. And I guess I find those naive, although perhaps not any more naive than the anti-transhumanists who believe there's some human essence that we simply need to fight to preserve as if we could and as if there were.
Right. So once we can set aside these naive views, then the question becomes, well, what changes should we expect, and which should we anticipate with eagerness, and which should we be wary of, and what can we do about any of them anyways?
And yes, and can anything be done about it? Yes, exactly. Well, I actually think there is a lot to be said for being clear-headed about what we can expect. Let me just give you one example. So a number of years ago, in the early 2000s, I was at a meeting at the National Science Foundation, group of people talking about technology and human performance enhancement. Every one of these people, a lot smarter than I could ever hope to be, many from industry and from academia and national laboratories. And they started talking about the potential capacity for direct brain-to-brain communications, and building scenarios around how such direct links would eliminate the sorts of misunderstandings that language creates. And I remember actually some specific examples were introduced. That if we had people who were from cultures that didn't get along with each other, if they could get past all that and simply communicate directly via some brain-to-brain interface, wouldn't that allow the sort of direct communication that could eliminate misunderstanding? And I found that alarmingly naive.
Yes.
In that it ignored the fact that there's all sorts of reasons that people have different values and disagree about things, and that in some cases the maybe obfuscating or camouflaging effects of language and circumlocution may be exactly what we need to keep people from killing each other.
Right.
So I do get concerned that the sort of naive utopian visions of those advancing the technologies often create false expectations and maybe distort the sorts of priorities that we have in deciding what we want to focus on.
Well, now that we've beaten up on these people all over the place, but maybe we should step up to the plate and say, how can we do better? Let's pick some set of changes that we might anticipate and do a better job of analyzing the consequences. More realistic, more pro and con. What would you like to pick?
Well, why don't we start with something simple that we're trying to wrestle with now, like physical enhancement, and sort of look at the way we try to deal with it in sports. There is some, in sports, there's some awareness that the sets of rules that athletes compete by allow one to have some sense of what fairness is, of what appropriate competition is. And even though obviously the landscape continually changes over time, obviously the sorts of things that athletes do now to prepare themselves are very different than they might have been 20 or 30 years ago. Nonetheless, we still accept that there's a landscape of enhancement that's okay, and there's a landscape of enhancement that we call cheating. And to me, the fact that it's somewhat arbitrary, that it reflects what our current values are about, what it's okay to use and what it's not okay to use, and what's normal and what's not. So what? I mean, the landscape does change, but we have the discussion, and I find that to be a nice analog to the sorts of maybe governance discussions that it's okay to have about human enhancement technology, because it tells us that yes, things will change. But nonetheless, we want to be clear at any certain point about where our values and norms lie, what's okay and what's not okay, and that in turn helps us decide where to focus our research efforts, where to focus our regulatory efforts in ways that maintain some sort of grip that society might have on the evolution of the technologies, even if it's not utter control, which of course is futile.
So let's talk about sports enhancement. one thing to just ask at the very beginning is, what is the point of a sport? Is it intended primarily to show some particular set of skills and have the best person with those skills win? What are exactly the skills you're trying to show? So, a very open-ended sport where you can pretty much bring any tool you like into play makes that sport more like a business or work environment where, or even a military environment where, whatever works is whatever wins is best. And there's some sense in which we want some areas of life where some other criteria hold, where what wins isn't just whoever has the most raw social resources, but maybe who has the best singing voice or the best coordination or the best raw stamina or something like that. Apparently there are environments where we'd like to see those qualities come out to the front. So
yeah, well, sure. And in fact, I think, again, the applicability to concerns about human enhancement there is pretty direct. So if we want to say that access to human enhancement technologies ought to be simply a function of individual economic wherewithal, then one scenario, and I don't think it's implausible at all, is that you'll see an increasing disparity among those who have access to enhancement and those who don't in society. And one ought to ask now whether or not that's a path we want to modulate, mediate, buffer, or whether we want it to be a free for all. And not worry about the consequences until we understand them. So, again, I think sports actually offers some pretty nice analogies for thinking that through.
Right, although I worry that sports is a little unusual and isn't more of a typical case in terms of kinds of future enhancements. That is, we do, I think of sports as a set-aside arena where we're trying to, reduce some outside influences in who wins. But in most of our competitive arenas in our lives, we don't try to do that. We allow and even encourage lots of outside influences to come and influence what happens.
Yeah, but I think it's very legitimate if one believes that potentially access to enhancement technologies could have a significant kind of magnifying effect on social inequities. Thinking through access issues could be really valuable. I think a great example, right? Maybe the ultimate in kind of democratic enhancement technologies are vaccines, right? All of our immune systems are highly enhanced as a result of vaccine technologies. And what's cool about it, of course, is that herd immunity means that for vaccines to be effective, pretty much everyone's got to get vaccinated. So there's kind of a inherent kind of democratizing, equity-enhancing logic to the effectiveness of the vaccine.
So I'm happy to explore the inequality dimension for a while, although I don't think it's so overwhelmingly important as some people sometimes think. But let's consider some military examples that strike me. One is the example once upon a time of some sort of fair military battle where, I guess, for example, at one point people thought of cavalry as a noble thing, and it seemed a little unfair if people could blow the cavalry off with some sort of guns or tanks. And then before guns, there was a lot of inequity in sort of raw military ability in terms of ability to wield a sword or how much armor you had. And then with the introduction of the gun, it was more democratizing. So there are many circumstances where introducing technology makes things more equal rather than less equal.
Well, maybe in the short term, and of course there's a continual maybe meta equilibrium that each side is trying to destabilize, right? So, I think it's good to get the military issue on the table here, because one key point, I think you'll agree with this, is it's probably the case that military applications will drive human enhancement technologies more than any other sector or area of application. And it's certainly then going to be the case that the U.S. and other more affluent nations with bigger investments in military technologies are going to be taking the lead here. And of course, the whole idea is to have an advantage over your adversaries, and that's what nations are trying to achieve with their investments. And it certainly raises then the question of is that something that can be or should be modulated? We've paid scant attention to it for most weapons and significant attention to it with, I guess we could argue about what the results are for nuclear weapons.
So I'd actually argue that if military is the main driving force of enhancement, then we aren't going to have that much enhancement. But basically, the military is a pretty small sector of our economy. Thankfully, not that many people die in wars. There's a fraction of people who die, and not that much of our overall budget goes to war. And so we have a lot of other parts of our lives where enhancements might be useful. And I would expect if enhancements ever became substantial and big, it would be because mostly we were using it in lots of other places and not just in the military.
Really, I guess I disagree with that. I'm surprised that, I don't disagree with your point about the absolute size of the military, but it does have certain attributes that often put it in the lead in developing technologies. Plus, it has certain exemptions from the rest of society that allow it to do so more at greater speed and with greater intensity. I think that unmanned aerial vehicles and robotics and the prospect of autonomous attack robots are a great example of something that is likely to have significant spillover, both into other nations' armaments, but also in other uses in society. So the issue isn't whether or not DoD is that big a part of the economy. The issue is, are they incentivized to push harder and faster on some of these technologies?
They're moderately pushing harder and faster, but still they're so small compared to the rest. I mean, even in the world of computers and automation, the military is a pretty small fraction of the world of computers and automation.
So you wouldn't agree, though, that their role was absolutely crucial in catalyzing information and communication technology simply by creating through their investments sectors of the economy and sectors of the knowledge creation industry and universities and industry that allowed us to build those new technological sectors?
Well, the military has often tried to take a leading role in advanced research, in part because it's often seen as some sort of crucial point. But most of the way the military uses computers is actually relatively, pulls back from innovation in the sense that the military needs things to be very hardened and very reliable, et cetera, in ways that the rest of the users don't. So
yeah, you're talking about now, but I guess I'm talking about their role in actually kind of catalyzing the creation of the technology and its applications through, funding the first research on it, creating computer science, material science departments, procuring outrageously expensive computers early on because they thought they'd be useful, and therefore kind of creating the capacity to...
Right. So I agree that the military has done, a larger fraction of basic research related to technology. It's not clear how much that actually influences the overall route of the technology. But
I guess I disagree. But anyway, but it is, I think, the case that they are exploring a range. I mean, it is, I know, the case that they're exploring a range of human enhancement technologies. Now, whether or not they're out in front of private industry, we could discuss. But
right. So I mean, let's get back to the basic issues of enhancement. I mean. So we were talking about sports. My attitude would largely be, well, if some sports wants to limit what kind of enhancements are allowed in that sport, so that's up to the players and fans of that sport to decide. It's not, I'm not going to take a big concern about it if it's not a sport I care much about. Similarly, in a workplace, even in a military workplace, if people are choosing enhancements in order to try to make their work be more productive, then I would think of that as a trade-off between how productive they can be and the various costs of the enhancements and side effects they might have to deal with. And again, maybe I shouldn't be very concerned about it. As an economist, I want to focus more on what we call the externalities, the reason why somebody else outside of that context might care more. What's in it for the rest of us?
Well, so I think this, again, I actually don't obsess about the sports thing too much, but I think your point is the one I would want to extrapolate more broadly, which is I think there is a strong strain of just let the technology evolve and stand out of its way in when we talk about innovation in a sort of general social and economic context, we want to let companies be as creative, as innovative as possible, and let the market decide what's going to get used. And yet, even as we say that, we know that technologies can have a huge destabilizing effect on people's lives. So in athletics, as you just said, we're willing to say, well, this is what we think is important in the game, and so we have an ongoing dialogue about the appropriate use of the technologies. And I actually think that's a potentially nice model to appropriate in society more broadly, where there is the potential for rapidly evolving technology to have significant social implications, as you say, outside of what is normally, can normally be captured in prices. So I think maybe it's a nice governance model, although I hadn't thought about it until today.
Right. So, I mean, if I wanted to focus on big forms of enhancement that make a big difference today, where there's a lot of things to worry about, I'd look at education, the industry that you and I are professionals in.
Yeah.
I mean, education is a major form of enhancement. And not only are there people using various drugs in education, but I would just think of schools themselves as a form of enhancement.
I agree. Yeah. And we're pretty bad at it.
Right, and so if you look at all the things that are going wrong with education, it's easy to sort of make complaints and think about how we could improve it. But you might expect that other forms of enhancement that appear later will have similar levels of dysfunction, perhaps, as we have in education. So, we have this vast system that you and I are a part of, where students spend huge amounts of time and money, and they don't seem to learn that much that's very useful in terms of the rest of their lives, which is striking. And yet people keep on doing it. So there's clearly a potential for some kinds of enhancement to become status symbols, and even if they aren't sort of overall useful in some basic sense, they become a way to distinguish some people over others, a way to show your social class or your intelligence or your connections and contacts, and various kinds of enhancements will be popular for those reasons.
So actually, I like your focus on education. So let's just talk about that a little bit more, because I think one depressingly remarkable attribute of the U.S. education system, at least, I'm not adequately familiar with other nations to know how this applies globally, is it's extraordinarily resistant to improved performance system-wide. Levels of literacy have remained more or less static pretty much since we've begun carefully measuring them, despite all that we seem to have learned about pedagogic technique and classroom environment and all this other stuff. So I actually think that would be a fabulous venue for concentrated focus on what technology can do to improve outcomes, because our largely non-technological approaches have been pretty dismal in their performance over the last 50 years. So what are your ideas there for where there might actually be areas to make a difference, or technological domain?
You might disagree, and you might not be surprised that I tend to want more of a deregulation approach there. That I think that we've regulated education pretty heavily and subsidized it and regulated through the subsidies as well, and that's a big part of why it's hard to change. But I also think we're just in a social equilibrium where people are very proud of, say, getting a college degree, and they're somewhat ashamed if they don't, and they want their kids to get one, and everybody wants to have one. Otherwise, you're not a reasonable person. You're not a cultured person. And but in fact, the college experience itself doesn't do that much to make you different.
Well, except it just simply raises the bar of what the lowest common denominator is to get a job. Which is probably incredibly inefficient. So I don't automatically disagree with your point about deregulation. I certainly think the public school systems are failing, but whether or not part of that is because they've been neglected is immaterial. The question is what to do now. But what's your sense of the potential for technologies to make a difference in education? that could be decisive in improving performance. Do you have a take on that?
I'm pretty skeptical, actually. We've had the ability to do movies and recordings of the best lectures instead of having all of us mediocre lectures for many decades, but we haven't switched to that. We've had lots of programmed learning or computer assisted learning possible for a long time, and we've mostly ignored that. So I got to say, I'm not really very optimistic. I can talk a little more about medicine, I guess, which is another big area where we have something like enhancements going on, where a lot of institutional failings, really.
Can we wait 1 second? I have a question about education I'd like to. As competition in the higher education market becomes more brutal, do you think that outcomes or educational outcomes, that is, are not going to matter, so that those who are better at using the technologies will not have an advantage over those who are less committed to using the technologies for enhancing educational outcomes?
Well, I definitely think technology matters in general. I'm just not, our current school systems don't do a very good job of training people in using technologies. So, for example, one of my sons is going to a video game specialty college where most of the curriculum is focused on learning to design and make video games. So it's an interesting intermediate mix. He's going to have a college degree, but it's going to be much more of a technical training. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to see more of that sort of thing in the future, where people actually learn lots of concrete things about doing something real somewhere. I'm not really optimistic about that taking over, because people tend to look down on them. They think you're not very cultured, et cetera, if you go through that process, even if you seem to be able to do the job.
Although, if those prepare people for jobs that they then can get, especially in an economy that's where the future of jobs is so uncertain and where they will be, don't you think that'll offer a comparative advantage that will then be self-reinforcing?
Well, it depends on how big an advantage it is and how big the disadvantage is of the perceived cultural lack.
Yeah. I mean, part of the problem is I think it is so difficult to judge outcomes. So there's actually some fabulous software that one can use. I was just talking to a colleague of mine at ASU about this, where he's teaching a class of 160 people. He can look at each one of them and see what they're doing. And he can actually see when individuals are having problems with particular concepts by looking at the choices that they make in what they click on in the curriculum that he's developed, and he can see students that are moving quickly through the curriculum, and those who get stopped by some concept that's too difficult for them, and end up kind of clicking on the same types of answers over and over again. So and he can then quickly home in on that person and help them out. So I mean, I do think that's the kind of thing that as a teacher without that sort of technology, you'd never know, or you could never do efficiently. So maybe the question is how do appropriate incentives get created so that better performance outcomes actually make a difference? You would think that people would care about that, but it seems to not drive the education market.
So if we can pop up to a higher level here and use what we've talked about as a driving example, we can say that if you think about education, we get into the details, we can start to see concrete things that go wrong and concrete ways we might try to improve things, and realize that although there are some things that might make things more effective, there are various kinds of symbolism and regulation and other sort of attitudes toward the industry that often make it hard to make changes. And the general point is that we can think about education as enhancement, but that doesn't get us very far in thinking about how we want to change it or what we want to do to it. We just really have to dive into the details and think about it in order to figure out how to improve it if we could. Similarly, for other sorts of future changes that might come up, it's not that helpful, I think, to call them enhancement and talk about whether you're pro or anti-enhancement. It's much more helpful to dive into the details of genetic engineering or robotics or whatever else it is, and look concretely at the specific things you might imagine coming, and then ask what specific problems they might produce, and then talk in detail about those problems and how to deal with them.
Yes, so let's then make a transition to medicine, as you suggested, and health, since obviously that is, as with education, a system that's significantly dysfunctional, it's clearly more subject to rapid proliferation of technologies than education, probably because the outcomes are more easily measured, and yet seems very unable, from the systems level, optimize its use of technologies for general health outcomes.
So let's just review some basics, which I presume you'll agree, but if you don't, you can speak up about medicine that people might not understand. First, medicine is not an especially research-intensive industry. The percentage of the industry that goes to research is relatively small compared to, say, computers or electronics or something like that. Secondly, it likes to present itself as a very scientific sort of industry, but the majority of things that a doctor might recommend to do to you, if you went to him and he said, let's try to do this, there is not an actual randomized trial study that supports his recommendation. It's much more seat of the pants based on what he seems to have heard or seen or things like that. So, medicine is just less scientific and less research-oriented than most people think.
But I'd even go further than that, actually. I mean, so as unscientific as it may be, it's also true that of the civilian U.S. R&D budget of about $60 billion, half of it goes to the National Institutes of Health, where the types of research that are done are, in general, remarkably insulated from the practice of medicine.
Right.
So not only do we have a medical practice that's significantly a craft skill, but we also have a knowledge generation enterprise that's incredibly insulated from the practice of that craft skill. So, it's very difficult to understand how we can link our research, or how we can link the research enterprises that we have and the significant investment we have to the practice of medicine. And the increased focus on jargon like evidence-based medicine and the idea of national databases, runs right up against exactly what you mentioned, which is the fact that we don't have much evidence for most of these treatments anyway, and the evidence that we have is usually limited and not particularly good.
Right.
So there's this bizarre contrast between our incredible potential to enhance and our limited institutional capacity to actually make that happen.
Now, when I've known people who have tried to sort of think about institutional changes in medicine and how to introduce them, they continually run up against the fact that medicine is very heavily regulated, even more so than education. A concrete example that I like to teach, I teach health economics, that 30 years ago, the field of artificial intelligence had a big branch of it that focused on trying to make what they called expert systems to reproduce medical decision making. And they had a number of systems that, at least in trials, could do as well as expert physicians in making various sorts of diagnosis. But, and that's when computers were thousands of times weaker than they are today. But they just couldn't field them from regulatory barriers, and so people eventually lost interest. You could only sell them to doctors, really. And doctors thought they were too slow. They could figure out the answer themselves.
Well, they also will put doctors out of work, right?
Right.
So it's not just regulatory barriers. This is the thing with all technological change, right? Is that there will be winners and losers, and the losers will do what they can to prevent their jobs from disappearing. So it's certainly not just a regulatory matter, right?
Right. I guess another thing to notice is that in most of our sort of studies where we look at some people who get more medicine versus other people who get less medicine, even in some randomized trials, we actually find remarkably little relationship between people who get more medicine, at least in terms of spending, and people who are healthier.
I actually thought that the farther you lived from a hospital, on average, the healthier you were likely to, certainly the fewer surgical procedures you were likely to have. And I guess, no difference in outcomes. That's right.
Right. Pretty much no difference in outcomes. Yeah. So a lot of people who are focused on enhancements are focused on medical-based enhancements. So to the extent you and I are somewhat skeptical about medicine in general, we're more skeptical about the near term of various medical-based, physical enhancements.
Well, but I think there's two things going on here, though, just in terms of enhancement. And this gets to some of the confusion around the whole transhumanism debate, too, though, which is so I think here you would perhaps agree that where medicine is effective, it's where there are simple, non-chronic, non-systemic interventions, problems that can be intervened in fairly directly. So we're good at trauma.
Gunshots.
We're good at things like replacing joints, and that sort of stuff. And we're not good at dealing with with systems-based problems like cancer, for example. So, and yet I think most of the demand and most of the resources are interested in the more chronic, more systems-based, more difficult to deal with problems. And in fact, of course, to say otherwise would be to say that you're not really interested in health. You're only interested in medical intervention, which is politically not very acceptable. So I think there is an interesting disparity between where the strengths of the science and technology are likely to lie, which is in intervening in places where the kind of cause and effect relations are easy to see, and sort of our notion of what health ought to be and how it ought to be improved.
Right. So I would say that the industry is driven overwhelmingly by sort of customer demand and the perceptions of a customer of what kind of products they'd like to have, and far less by the actual producer capability and what products they can reliably and usefully produce.
All right. So let me ask, how would you deal with that?
Well, I would deregulate.
Except you're saying that's a reflection of, aren't you saying that's a reflection of what the customer wants?
It is. So, in fact, we have a lot of regulation in part because customers are scared about medicine, they're scared about death, and they'd like someone to be in control. My actual attempt to find a politically feasible compromise would be to municipalize medicine. Would be to say, let's let counties run medicine, and they each pay for it in their local county budget. And they can be completely government run. Even though I'm relatively libertarian, I'll say, fine, entirely government run medicine, but at the county level. And then when some counties go wild on spending, which some do, they will suffer, and one way or the other, people will move away, or the county will just prosper less. And other places that
they might suffer, they might do better, depending on how they spend, right?
Right, but the point is there'll be variation, and the ones that do badly on the variation can suffer, and the ones that do better can thrive, and people can move from resources and people from the places that do badly to the places that do better.
So let's connect that to the enhancement discussion then. So where do you think there are big technological opportunities in the health domain for significant benefits that are being missed now because of what you'd see as the kind of distorted incentives and regulatory system?
I mean, the major problem is we're spending vastly too much money for too little benefit. So the low-hanging fruit is just to cut half of the spending, basically.
Yeah.
And not suffer very much on health. Once we have vastly less spending, I would think that then we'd have a better relationship between spending more and actually having effect, and then the incentives for innovation would be much better. So at the moment, the incentives for innovation is just make up a treatment and get people to spend money on it. It doesn't that much matter how effective it is because you'll still get paid, and it can be another 10 or 20 years before people find out it doesn't work very well, before you can move on to the next one.
Okay, so this is quite bizarre, though, right? Because we use technologies because we're trying to achieve some outcome with them, and our whole discussion here is framed by this notion that enhancing our cognitive and physical capabilities and well-being is a significant part of what the kind of the technological project is, right? And yet at the same time, people seem either unwilling or unable or uninterested to make choices about technologies that actually lead to better outcomes in terms of their enhancement. So what's going on there?
Well, this is actually a focus of my research over the last few years. So I think that we have a bunch of standard stories about what things are for that are wrong, and that people actually have other agendas and purposes for many of the major industries and areas of our lives. So I don't think we actually go to the doctor to get well, and I don't think we go to school to learn. Medicine and education have social functions in our lives, but we lie to ourselves about what those functions are, because the things we say are their functions sound more noble and high and idealistic than the things we're actually doing. I think in medicine we're more often trying to show that we care and show our alliance and loyalty toward each other than to actually make things more healthy. I think in school we're more often trying to show that we're better than other students in terms of conscientiousness and intelligence, and the actual amount we learn isn't so important. And I think similarly in a number of other areas of our lives, even in sports, it isn't for what we say it's for. So people talk about sports as if it's there to build teamwork, it's there to exercise and get coordination. And I think, more obviously, sports is there to show off. People who do well at sports look good, and they attract mates and they attract associates in many other ways, and that's socially functional for them. But it's not as noble as saying, it's about competition and the human's expanse of the human spirit, etc.
Well, there's another possibility, right, which would be that people do sincerely believe in those higher motivations, and they've been, for whatever reason, convinced that that's what they're doing, but that's not actually what they're doing. And I'm thinking about the role of information in decision-making, right? So organizations are continually trying to acquire more information to base their decision-making on, but people who study decision-making have known for decades that more information generally has no impact on
that's right.
decision-making.
So in fact, I'd say managers like to present themselves as if they're heroic decision makers, scientific spreadsheet.
But
analysts,
I think they are.
Not true.
But they think they are.
Well, they think they are at one level because it's the sort of thought that makes you look good, but their actions reveal other sorts of intention.
Yeah, but see, okay, so this may be the difference between the economist in you and the whatever I am, in that I think that that there are some sort of powerful myths around that allow us to rationalize our behavior and convince ourselves that what we're doing makes sense. So acquiring more information, that's what as Enlightenment creatures we're supposed to do, right? And the idea that more information actually isn't making a difference or serves some kind of totemic purpose, is something that it's too difficult to even confront. So in some sense, the problem maybe is more difficult the way I'm framing it because it seems like people simply can't kind of confront the institutional and cultural constraints on their decisions.
I think I'm agreeing with you a lot more than I expected to, and perhaps more than you expected to. But let's continue to explore this key point. You see a number of myths that we have about what we're doing, myths that are wrong, and I agree that those myths are there. I think you seem to see them as some sort of a cultural accident, and I see them as there on purpose. They were designed to be there. They serve a function, and they've been there for a very long time. They aren't recent innovations.
Well, tell me what you mean by design. So because it's only a step from what you're saying to being conspiratorial minded, which I don't think you are. Right?
No, I'm not thinking socially conspiratorial. I'm thinking more of an evolutionary psychology sense that we were designed to be hypocritical in many ways.
Sure. Yes.
So one concrete example would be our social status moves. Have you read about that when people are talking to each other, at least in person, not like we're talking, they hold their shoulders certain ways, they put their back a certain way, they spread theirs out in the space, they lower their tone of voice, they do a number of things to express their status relative to the other person, and they have sort of a dance of relative status. And actors have to learn these status moves and act them so that they can look realistic on stage. Now, we all do these things, but if you tell people that they do these things, especially with their friends, they deny it immediately. They say, no, I couldn't possibly be doing that. This is just a friend. I'm not trying to, dominate my friend. I'm just having a good time with my friend. And so we are clearly built to do these things. They are ancient capacities. This didn't show up in the 20th century. But we are also built to not be aware that we're doing them. And this is one example of many, many examples of things that humans do that are functional and achieve ends, but they don't seem very consciously aware of. In fact, they deny if you point it out to them, unless you point it out very clearly. So I'd say this is an ancient human capacity and feature that we are in denial about many of the kinds of things we do in many of our social interactions and institutions. So
let me see if can we tie this back then into the enhancement theme. In that it sounds like part of your argument then, if I'm understanding it, is that these strategically important, even if unconscious modes of behavior prevent us from making decisions that you would consider, should I use the word rational? I don't want to put bad words in your mouth, but that maybe prevent us from employing technologies as effectively as we would to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve, and that you're seeing that in education, in healthcare.
I'd rephrase it. I'd say there are the things we say we're trying to do, and then there's the things we're actually trying to do. In some sense, we want to do them both, but we give a lot more priority to what we're typically actually trying to do than what we give lip service to. That interferes with achieving the things we give lip service to. So we could learn better and more usefully if we actually wanted to learn better and more usefully, but we have other priorities, and that gets in the way. Same for medicine. Yeah, we'd like to live longer. It's not like we want to die, but in fact, if medicine is achieving these other social functions primarily, then we sacrifice the apparent functions more often for the more behind-the-scenes functions.
But then, I mean, aren't you then asserting a sort of arithmetic formula that goes from individuals to institutional behavior? I mean, I guess I would have a somewhat different view because. So in healthcare, for example, we all know the U.S. spends outrageous amounts of money on healthcare and relative to other countries, even on healthcare research and development for rather poor performance outcomes. Now, whatever the motives of a person in going to the doctor might be, it seems hard to connect that to the systems dysfunction that lead to the bad performance at the systems level. So I'm not sure how do you get from. So I guess it's part of your point. Sorry, go ahead.
Clearly, there's two kinds of influences going on. There is sort of broad, basic human nature and human habits, and then there are various local circumstances, various local institutional rearrangements, local strategic competitions, etc., that influence the details of local outcomes. Both of the things are happening. In order to distinguish them, one simple strategy is to simply look at broad trends in human history across time and space, and those are more likely to be attributed towards sort of very basic human drives, and the more local variations will be more due to some particular changes. So the fact that the U.S. spends more than anywhere else in the world is probably due to something about the U.S., but if you look at 2000 BC medical textbooks, you will find doctors acting in many ways remarkably similar to modern doctors. You'll see they had very complicated recipes for using very obscure ingredients. They said very strange words, and most of it didn't work. Yet they were paid a lot. And so some features of medicine do seem to be robust features across societies and time, so we can attribute them.
I want to offer a somewhat simple-minded addendum to this, though, which is it seems to me that certain technologies do end up cutting across these kinds of historical, anthropological aspects of institutions and humans in institutions, right? So just to take one maybe extreme example, right? We did pretty much wipe smallpox off the face of the earth, and we did it because we had a technology that was incredibly effective at doing it,
yep.
and the effects of it were noticeable, and
yes,
and so you could show people that it worked, and I think that's maybe a key difference between technologies that get adopted to genuinely enhance human prospect, and those that seem to just kind of reside out there unused or inadequately used, because you have to convince people that in fact they'd be made better off as a result of using them, and because in many cases their efficacy isn't particularly well demonstrated. It's hard to ever actually do this, the large-scale experiment for good or for ill. So it does seem like things happen on occasion, right? That cut through. I don't know whether you want to call them pathologies or not, but that cut through the kind of social and institutional inertias you talk about with technologies that are very effective.
Agreed.
So. This maybe suggests that the other things we're talking about, how important is regulation, how important are customs, are secondary to how important are the technologies themselves, which of course is the kind of thing that my social science friends would castigate me for even saying.
It's clearly true that some particular technologies have shown up that were so spectacularly effective at achieving the ends people said they want to achieve that they were shamed into adopting them. Because otherwise they would just be completely obviously admitting they don't want what they say they want.
Well, but so this is really interesting, actually, because I have always asserted as kind of a zeroth order definition of rationality that people actually do want to achieve mostly what their decisions are aimed at achieving. And you're saying that you think that's actually nonsense in many cases, right?
So here I'm being the economist, and by your definition of rationality, I'm advocating for irrationality, but it's a different concept of rationality.
Sure.
So
yeah.
I'm talking about sort of the thing people give lip service to, the thing people say they're trying to achieve, and I say that often they're actually not trying very hard to achieve the thing they're saying to achieve.
But it may not be because they're trying hard or not trying hard. It may simply be because they're kind of cultural imagination has been captured. So we go to doctors to get better, right? I mean, whether or not that's a primitive superstition or a function of modernity is almost irrelevant. It's just what we're conditioned to believe.
We're conditioned to believe it. We're conditioned to say it, but our actual actions are remarkably unresponsive to that apparent motivation. So, for example, when you give people concrete data about the quality of their hospital or their doctor in terms of raw mortality rates or things like that, people are remarkably uninterested in that data, unresponsive to it, and they're willing to pay very little to achieve it.
Yeah, but isn't that because people trust and by the way, I'm not saying that this is correct. That is empirically correct, but they trust their own instincts and heuristics and experiences, right? So they may believe the data, but it still doesn't matter to them.
And that's another way of saying that they tell themselves, I'm like a CEO or a manager. He says, I'm a decision maker. I make rational decisions, and that's what he says to himself. And he makes sure he looks at spreadsheets twice a day or something to assure himself of that. But his actual actions don't fit that very well. But he just assumes his actions fit that. He doesn't very consciously examine his actions to see whether they fit it. He basically says, well, since this is what I say I'm doing, I must be actually doing it. Therefore, I'll just assume that my actions fit that. Similarly, with somebody deciding which doctor to go to, they just assume they're looking for health, and so they don't even bother to check whether their actions fit it. But when people are much more serious about actually achieving an end, they do pay more attention to these things.
Yes. So this gets me back to two things. One is the military, where because often there is much more at stake, and you can tell if you're succeeding or not succeeding. There's more of a commitment to actually making progress on technologies, and I think it will be increasingly on enhancement technologies, than we'll find in other sectors. And the other question the other issue is has to do with causal chains and people's understanding of them, right? And so. Do we trust some particular expert who tells us that they have access to insight into, what our action will actually lead to, or do we trust our own instincts? And there's plenty of reasons not to trust experts in many of these domains. So, I guess I find it hard to fault individuals for rejecting apparently authoritative statements about what they ought to do. Given how flawed expert judgment in these cases, health, tends to be.
I'm not recommending or even noticing that people aren't following experts. I'm noticing that people are doing sort of very basic things that would help them achieve what they say they're trying to achieve. So my major piece of data would be to say the things that people actually do isn't a random variation on the things they say they're trying to do. The things they actually do often make a lot of sense, are often quite coherently structured relative to the things I say they are actually trying to achieve. That makes it much more sense to say they're built to actually do some things and to say that they're doing other things than to think that they really want to do what they say, but they just are too confused and mixed up to understand how to do it well. That would make much more sense if they were just really, really very random about what they did.
Yeah.
But they're not random at all. They're really quite systematic.
So then why haven't technologies been introduced more systematically into, say, health systems and education systems that actually do help people achieve what it is that they say they want to achieve?
Because that often comes at the conflict of the things they are actually trying to achieve.
So would you say that one way to address that disparity is, or that conflict or tension is do we need to be more explicit about it? Do we need to put people's cognitive dissonance in their face more unavoidably? Well,
it's kind of fun to do that. So some of us
right.
contrarian folks enjoy doing that, but whether people appreciate that or how helpful it is less clear. So obviously one of the things that's going on is that people don't want to be overt about some of the things they're doing, and they deny and resist and will punish you for trying to expose them in various ways. But I think as an institutional reformer, one of the most important things I learned is that, I look at medicine and I invent another institution for buying medicine, which I did, and I thought, this is great. And then I tried to explain it to people and say, wouldn't you like this? And I was just puzzled why they didn't have an argument against it so much as they just weren't interested. And in order to understand that better, I delved into a lot of different things in medicine, and then came up with the explanation of, well, they just have other agendas. So I think in order to help people to better achieve what they say they're trying to achieve, you do have to understand quite a bit about what they're actually achieving and find a way to sort of achieve one without coming at the expense of the other.
Yes. So maybe to kind of to wrap up, here's an example where I think that kind of thing is actually very much very conspicuous, and that's in the debate over technologies as applied to what are often called disabilities, and particularly things like cochlear implants, right? Where you get a debate over whether cochlear implants, which are apparently reasonably effective ways to deal with people with serious hearing impairments, are appropriate, or whether they are in fact assaults on the non-hearing culture. Right. And I find that to be at least refreshing in the clarity of the dilemma. But is that a kind of a is that a
sure? I mean,
the conspicuous of that seems kind of rare, but it seems to symbolize the sort of dispute you're talking about that's normally more unconscious.
Right, so a lot of the things we do to find a way to identify with and celebrate the culture and group that we are from, and we celebrate the technology as an indirect way to celebrate us. So, we Americans are probably especially into the iPhone because it came from America. And we like to celebrate it and say, isn't this a cool phone? And that indirectly celebrates us, but we don't have to kind of admit that we're bragging about us. We're just kind of saying, isn't this a cool gadget? And so often we're especially eager to celebrate technology that we think that reflects well on us. So I think it's one reason that, for example, most of the people we're focused on isn't the future technology cool, tend to be technologists, engineers, other people whose job is technology, right? Because indirectly it celebrates them when they say, the thing that matters about the world is technology and how that's going to change everything, and all your politics and all your other stuff doesn't matter very much. It basically says people like me matter a lot, and all the rest of you don't matter so much.
So should I take from that that your view on enhancement technologies is that to some extent they will just be expressions of local cultural contexts, and that we should not expect them to be hugely transformative influences any more so than they've been, at least?
So we're almost out of time here, but I would say that modest, small enhancements that give you modest improvements are mostly, fielded as ways to express various cultural identities and loyalties. Really big enhancements will just drive away that, because they're so powerful that you'll just have to adopt them, right? So different military cultures had different respect for the cavalry versus infantry versus things like that. But when you had like big guns and tanks, that just overwhelmed the rest, right?
Yeah.
Some militaries fielded the cavalry and they just got wiped out, and everybody learned, okay, you got to adopt these big things because they're really powerful. So I think there are some technologies coming down the line that when they're really big and powerful, that functional advantage will just overwhelm the various cultural reluctance, and it will make a huge difference.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So this gets to a theory that I think we do converge around, right? Which is that that whatever the source of dysfunction in our institutions that causes people to act in ways that don't seem to advance the outcomes that they desire, those can be overridden when particularly effective technologies come on the scene that basically make it impossible to step out of their way. So, do you agree with that?
I agree with that, although with the caveat that as we get richer, that gets harder.
It gets harder because the signal to noise technologically
just because
is so high?
we're lazy and comfortable.
Oh, yeah,
we're less willing to take a big chance and take a big disruption in order to be more effective because we figure we're doing pretty well as it is.
So is that a prediction that the locus of rapid human enhancement of technologies will be in developing countries where they're less complacent?
I think so. And also just in a future era, as we could talk about in a future podcast perhaps, I think there's a particular coming technology of a certain kind of robotics that will be so overwhelmingly effective that, places that adopt it will just completely dominate the rest.
So should we leave with a question about whether or not that's something we should look forward to or dread?
It's certainly, we should do both.
Okay.
And we'll have to think about the details of that perhaps at some other time.
All right. Well, why don't we defer that to hopefully a future conversation?
That's right. So in case everybody's listening, we're making an offer here.
Okay, Robin. Well, it's been great talking to you.
It's been nice talking to you.
Look forward
Take
to
care.
Bye-bye.